Surveillance and Censorship in the Digital Age. I'm Tonya Hall, and joining me is Alex Gladstein, Chief Strategy Officer at the Human Rights Foundation. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you.
So, what does the Human Rights Foundation do?
The Human Rights Foundation is a nonprofit that helps promote and protect civil liberties for people who live under authoritarian governments. And that's a really large percentage of humanity. If you consider that something like 93 countries are authoritarian, it constitutes about 4 billion people.
Then let's talk about a part of that protection, what that might be. Let's talk about surveillance and censorship in the digital age. How do you see issues evolving in nations that are generally considered to be liberal democracies?
Yeah, so obviously democracy to dictatorship is a spectrum from Norway to North Korea, right? We have countries that are very much free and open, and then we have countries that are extremely closed. In my view, surveillance is a threat to everybody because the difference between a very Orwellian police state like China and perhaps a liberal democracy is sometimes just a matter of technology in terms of what the government and the sort of corporate establishment is allowed or not allowed to do, right? And the only real thing protecting people who live in like more free societies from people who live in dictatorships are these rules, that exist in society: rule of law, civil liberties, free speech, things like that. As soon as those rules go away, everything kind of conflates together, right? So just because you live in a country like France or Germany or Japan or Chile or Canada doesn't mean that you shouldn't be worried about surveillance, because the erosion of democratic ideals can happen really, really quickly if you ask people in countries like Venezuela, for example. And at the end of the day, you want to be ready and you want to always be vigilant about your rights and freedoms.
The 20th century American town square was a physical public space where people could talk about topics with First Amendment protection. In the 21st century, digital town squares belong to private social media platforms operating under terms and services agreements. So should these digital town squares be allowed to censor speech given their near monopoly status?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is obviously the canvas of debate that's unfolding in front of us. I mean, from a civil liberties point of view, I think we want to start at the position of the government should not be in the business of censoring speech. So therefore, the government should not be allowed, or we should create protections against government officials from saying, oh, well, we don't really like your speech or this person's speech or that person's speech, therefore we're going to put you in jail. I mean, this is what happens in dictatorships, right? It gets tricky with private corporations, right? Or private companies, because technically they own, that particular set of private property. They own that, as you say, that particular, let's say, digital landscape. It's theirs, right? So on the one hand, part of us thinks that, oh, they should be able to make the rules. But then again, part of us looks at like the civil rights here in the United States and says, well, restaurants that, controlled a piece of property decided not to let certain people in because of the color of their skin. And it was actually important for the government, people through its representative officials in our capital, to actually create laws to prevent that from being a possibility, right? So we're now seeing potentially a repeat of that phenomenon where people are demanding some sort of law that would prevent certain things from being said on the internet. And I think we just have to be really careful here so as to not give too much power to corporations and governments.
What level of privacy should people expect when you've got traffic and body cams running, facial recognition algorithms everywhere? Should governments be required to disclose the types of information they collect with these types of devices?
Yes, I guess that's two questions. So what should you expect? You should expect nothing. You should expect no privacy whatsoever. Expect is probably the wrong word to use. You should fight for full privacy. So we should have a technological and social environment where we have total control over our data, over our location data, health data, financial data, communications data. I think that should be the dream, is that we actually control these things. The reality is far from that, right? But I think as technologists, as civil rights advocates, and as companies and government officials that need to be pushed, like we need to fight for that kind of reality, right? Now, when it comes to the idea of actual in practice privacy, there are some pretty exciting technological developments happening now that actually give us some hope that this is possible, right? So not only do you have encrypted messaging, where through apps like Signal, it's virtually impossible for a foreign government, a corporation, whomever, to access your messages with someone else unless they compromise your physical device, right? So if this has been physically compromised, I'm toast. But generally speaking, there is software protocols people have developed to allow us to have control over our communications. We are also there with money, right? So after the invention of Bitcoin, people have been able to use particular kinds of operational security to have a similar privacy over financial transactions. And that's only going to get better in the future. The big question for me is like all the other kinds of data. When we talk about health data or location data or behavioral data, this sort of more complex data, are we going to be able to secure that and own that and be sovereign to that while still preserving the right to sell it if we want to? And this is a particular area that I believe is best described as zero knowledge cryptography, where there are companies and startups and research groups trying to create cryptography that can like basically secure our complex data so that we own it, and then that we would give permission to companies and governments, and we would get to disclose whatever we want to disclose. So that's the area that I'm looking at most closely, and that's kind of the area of technology that I think is going to be the most pivotal when we talk about the future of our digital freedom.
But don't governments have a responsibility to protect public safety? And how do they do that if everything's encrypted?
I just have this firm belief that public safety and fighting the bad guys, which I do agree on, and of course I want to support, does not require the surveillance state. I mean, I think things in democracies like the Patriot Act and these sort of things are counterproductive. I don't think that, for example, something like 9/11 happened because we didn't have an Orwellian police state. I think it happened because of quite obvious inefficiencies inside our intelligence agencies. And you can read a book like The Looming Tower, which won a Pulitzer, and it really describes this in tragic, vivid detail. I don't buy the line that we need to give up all of our freedoms and privacies and liberties in order to have safety. And it also doesn't make any sense. If you actually look at what societies in the world are the most violent and the most corrupt, they are police states, dictatorships, tyrannies. The most safe and trusting and open societies are the ones that are democracies, are the ones with less rules, less laws. So I just think based on both like history and principle, we should reject the surveillance state, and we should basically ask our governments and our police forces to secure us with legitimate sort of like old school investigative police work and, community policing as opposed to surveillance.
Have you seen any evidence that other countries are considering China's social credit score model?
Absolutely. It's not just evidence, it's export. So what we're seeing in a thumbnail sketch essentially is the Chinese government over a decade modifying, tinkering, and kind of starting to perfect this idea of how they're going to control their own citizens within their own borders using a two-step surveillance process where they suck up all of your different kinds of data, and then they start using incentives and disincentives to control you to make you self-censor so that you'll be patriotic, right? So you'll be like a good citizen. Now that technological infrastructure they're exporting around the world. So they've sold this to countries like Zambia in South Africa. They've sold this to countries like Venezuela and Latin America. They've sold this to other countries in Asia. And this kind of infrastructure, which is part of this Belt and Road project, which is the largest infrastructure project in human history, 10 times bigger than the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe after World War II. This project, which is at this point, it has involved more than $400 billion of loans and investments from the Chinese government across literally the whole sweeping world from Southeast Asia, Middle East, all the way to Latin America, involves the creation of surveillance telecommunications infrastructure and smart cities. Now, when your listeners hear the word smart city, they should immediately assume it means surveillance city. A smart city is literally just a city where the government has a lot more surveillance cameras. So I think we need to make sure that we have human cities, not just smart cities. Like, we need to make sure that the city officials who are trying to make our lives perhaps better from a real noble kind of like honest point of view, in terms of allowing us to use public transportation better and allowing us to like save energy and things like that. We need to be able to do that in a way where we preserve our rights and liberties. And that's not this sort of Chinese blueprint. And I don't trust literally any government to, by themselves, without our public pressure, do anything any differently. Even in Europe today, Italy and Switzerland and Greece and so many different countries are installing this sort of Chinese infrastructure. And it's just something that is totally, antithetical to the idea of privacy and freedom.
Alex Gladstein, Chief Strategy Officer of the Human Rights Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your ideas on this and what we need to do. If somebody wants to connect with you, how can they do that?
Yeah, I would love to keep talking with people about the power of encryption technology and Bitcoin and other innovations to protect our freedom, and also keep talking with you about how we should expose projects which endanger our liberties. And you can reach me on Twitter at Gladstein, my last name, or by email at alex@hrf.org. So thanks so much for having me on.
Absolutely. And if you guys want to find more of my interviews, you can do that right here or go to tonyahall.net. Thanks for watching.